Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Glad we could get set up a couple minutes late, but I think we're good to go. So today, we're going to talk about happiness, and it's a beautiful day to talk about happiness, and it's always a good day to reflect on it. And this is something that we had talked about sometime back in the fall. To me, it's one of the most powerful things that we have control over, that we can do to actually make our lives better. There are a lot of misconceptions about happiness, though, where it comes from, how it works, how we should think about it. And so I'm going to talk a little bit today about the science of happiness and then the concrete things that we can do to make ourselves happier, and then address some of the challenges that we might face in doing that. So, we have enshrined in some of our founding documents the pursuit of happiness, right? That happiness is a thing to be pursued. I wonder about that statement because I think it implies that it's something that you find, and that it's something you find somewhere outside of yourself. But happiness, in fact, isn't something that can be generated from an external source, and there's a lot of good research on that. So there's some really great TED Talks, and so I think the one is by Dan Gilbert that talks about this particular study that he did, that between someone who was paralyzed for life and someone who is a lottery winner, who do you think would be more happy? Right? That seems as though there would be a fairly clear outcome and who would be more happy, right? Most people would think the lottery winner would be happier. But what they found was that after the initial reaction to the event that either caused you to be paralyzed for life or that caused you to win the lottery, there was actually a regression back toward a normal. Now, that's not to say they were the same amount of happy, but the difference was significantly less than you might think. So the idea that some event, some achievement, some external thing is going to make you happy, it just isn't supported by the neuroscience of today. And he said there was about 3 months to a year to recover from whatever that thing was that set you off of your normal happiness track, if you want to call it that. So that then implies that there is sort of a normal out there, at least for you, for each of us as an individual. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you can change that normal to be higher or lower, basically, depending on your circumstances. There's also this meme or this idea out there called the crab mentality. So if there are a bunch of crabs in a bucket, if one crab starts to climb out of the bucket, the other crabs will grab it and pull it down because they're all trying to climb out of the bucket, right? So there's this idea, I think, in society today that we should hide our happiness because someone out there might not be as happy as we are. And so I want to challenge that because instead of saying, well, I'm happy, but I should hide it because some people might be going through something in their lives, I think causes us to basically depress our overall level of happiness across society. And the other thing I would question in terms of this crab mentality is, what example are we setting for our children? What example are we setting for others, just people around us? Right? When we're at work, people will mention, oh, that person's always cheerful, always happy. They're pleasant to be around. Right? And if we're hiding that, how are we helping those other people to see that there is another possibility other than being miserable all the time? So Tim Ferriss is a writer and a blogger and a podcaster and does really interesting things, a lot of self-experiments. And he realized that he has this self-narrative that was so negative and so caustic to him that it was causing him significant amount of distress. And he realized that he would never, ever say the things he said to himself in his mind out loud to someone else. And I think that's important to note because a lot of times we can be our own harshest critic. And it's okay to be self-reflective and it's okay to be self-critical in terms of getting better. But it's not okay to run ourselves into the ground and put on this false facade to say, I'm a terrible person, but I'm just going to pretend like everything's okay. Right? We have to give ourselves a little bit of grace and a little bit of forgiveness and allow ourselves to be happy. At least create the space for that to happen. So there's this happiness course at Yale. It's now the most popular course at Yale. So it's basically called How to Be Happy. And this course basically goes into the science of happiness. It gives people, you can take it online actually. I think it's on Coursera. It's called The Science of Well-Being. It's one of the courses. I think it's a free course. And a lot of the course material is now available online. But it's amazing, and this is a recent course. Only within the last few years did this course come to be. So the person who talks about it, there's a TED Talk for this as well, is Laurie Santos. And I'll post these links online later. But people come in with these expectations of what it is that's going to make them happy. I'm going to graduate this class. I'm going to get this grade. I'm going to buy this car. I'm going to get this job. And it turns out that none of those things allow you to be happy. There's one of the things that Dan Gilbert talks about is this idea of impact bias. We think things are going to have a greater impact on our lives than they actually do. So another talk, this one's really great. So his name's Sean Achor, and his talk is basically the happy secret to better work. The story he shares is about his sister. So he's young, he's playing with his sister, they're playing on a bunk bed. And his sister, while they're playing around, falls off the bed and breaks her arm. And so he sees in her eyes the tears are welling up and she's about to cry. And so I think he was 8 or something like that. In his 8-year-old brain, he came up with this idea, or 10-year-old brain, this distraction idea. And he says to his sister, "Oh my gosh, do you know that the only animal that can land like that is a unicorn?" And in his sister's mind, she was struggling then against, I might be a unicorn and my arm is broken. And she ended up going back and playing, and then they had to go to the hospital later because her arm was broken. But isn't that incredible? Just this little thought of some sort of amazement caused her to be able to tolerate that level of pain, right? To recage her frame of what was happening in the moment, what she was experiencing. And so one of the things he talks about in there is that work is not going to make you happy. No level of achievement or raises or whatever it is going to get you to the level of happiness that you think you want to be at. But what he did find is that being happy actually makes you more productive at whatever it is that you're doing. And it's all about framing the way you think about what it is that you do. So back to Dan Gilbert. So when I was mentioning that idea that between being a paraplegic and winning the lottery, that there's not much difference, what Dan Gilbert talks about is that there's a psychological immune system that we have. And that all of us are programmed through a variety of inputs over the course of our lives to sort of behave at a certain norm. Where if something happens to us, we might be sad for a period of time, and then we might eventually recover, or we might be happy for a period of time, but eventually we're going to come down from that. And so the psychological immune system is important to realize because it is something that's programmed. It is something that exists in our minds, but that we don't consider. And so Gilbert, in his studies, has found that you can create synthetic happiness, right? Which, to me, I even question the use of that term, synthetic happiness, because happiness is what's perceived. It doesn't matter if it's created by you or if it's generated, by circumstances. It's just how you perceive the world. And he said that changing your mind is actually the key to happiness. And so we're always going to have ups and downs, and those are going to provide us the variances that allow us to appreciate the things that are good in life, right? Without darkness, there is no light, that sort of idea. But so how do we get after that, right? So there's science out there, there's research. I'll post those links, you can take a look at them. They're really good talks, by the way. I really recommend that you look at them. But the way we start to get after that is perspective. It's really difficult to see what you have if you don't have a good perspective. And what that requires is a little bit of opening your eyes and opening your world to realizing what's out there, what's in the realm of possible, and ideally experiencing something beyond the boundaries of where you grew up and how you grew up. Now, we're very fortunate today that we can do that through technology. We can watch documentaries, we can visit places around the world simply by getting on our computer. So many of us also have had the opportunity to travel and actually see different places in the world and see how other people live and appreciate what it is that we have. Right? You've all heard someone complain about first world problems, right? The Wi-Fi is slow, or Netflix isn't working, right? Somebody parked in 2 parking spaces, right? All of those little things that really annoy us because we lose perspective about what's really happening in life. And we allow those things to ruin our days. Another way to gain perspective is to listen. To go out and actually listen to people. Listen to their stories, what they've been through, and particularly listen to people who are different from us. I've had the opportunity even just recently to listen to people who are different than me and realize the challenges that they face, and it helps me to remember what my perspective is, how I'm programmed, and then how I can at least consider what I have and be grateful for it. This is important because otherwise the only way to gain perspective is to do it yourself. And doing it yourself, particularly in terms of gaining perspective and experience, can be a very painful process. And that's okay. That's how we learn. Right? Comfort is the opposite of growth. If we're comfortable all the time, we're not learning anything. We're not going anywhere with our lives. So, either way, whether you do it yourself or whether you experience it through others and try and internalize and empathize with those are great ways to gain perspective, but it's something that's absolutely necessary. So, I've had the opportunity to go to Afghanistan and be out with the people of Afghanistan. And what was amazing to me was not their level of suffering. It wasn't the bombings, and it wasn't, how they lived, the things they had or the things they didn't have. The things that I remember were people smiling, people caring for their families. I remember children running around playing a sort of strange version of Red Rover. And they're playing in this rocky dirt field outside of their school. Many of them don't have shoes on. And they're laughing and having a good time just like kids anywhere else in the world. And when you look at what they have versus what we have, it's practically nothing. And yet they still were having a great time. And I still saw people playing with their families. And I still saw people trying to provide for their families. And it was no different than here. And while I was there, I also saw the effects of war. I've had to put American soldiers who were killed and still warm into body bags. And the same thing with Afghan nationals who came in through our base. And I've seen what the world has to offer in terms of the joys and the sorrows. And that experience has allowed me to come back and, for me anyway, focus on what is actually important in life. So that experience changed me for the better. It's not something I would wish upon anyone. It's not something I would say is an experience that I want people to go through as something formative in their lives. Hopefully they can learn from my story and at least appreciate a small amount of what that means. But when I came back from that, after I had thought about it for a while, and it took me a good 6 months to a year to recover to the point where I was kind of normal again in terms of my stress processing. But after that, my new normal, my new psychological immune system baseline was significantly de-escalated in terms of stress. Because when I look at things, especially in the near term after I got back, it was like, no one's shooting at us today. Everything's okay. You know, whatever issue we're having, there's an extra charge on the card or there's some busy thing happening at work. Literally no one is shooting at us today. And that's a pretty good place to be. So what I would ask is, when we're considering our daily issues, one of the things that we can do is find a little bit broader perspective. What challenge are we facing today, and how does that match up with the challenges that we have faced? How does it match up with what's going on in the world? How does that help us to focus on how to solve a problem versus what the problem is, right? Most of us, myself included, are really good at complaining, right? We're really good at identifying the problem. Well, this is a problem, right? But it's not about being problem focused, it's about being solution focused. Like you do have to identify the problem, whole root cause analysis, it's all very important. But then how do we solve it? How do we get to a solution even if it's not right? How do we start to move forward with the problem we have? So that gets us to gratitude. So there are a lot of good studies as well that talk about gratitude as a practice, right? And it's something that we've actually, my wife and I have started to institute with our children. Generally at dinner times, we'll ask what everyone was grateful for today. And they just have to, they're very young, so they just have to come up with one thing that they were grateful for. And this isn't something that I grew up doing, and so it's new even for me. But I think it helps us to realize that there was something good every day. Every day there was at least one good thing. And so many of you may have seen there's a 30-day challenge with gratitude. And generally you write 3 things, either in a diary or whatever it happens to be. And it doesn't have to be profound, right? But you'd be amazed with how many things you can be grateful for and how many things there are, especially in our world here, to be grateful for. One of the things this does is actually counteracts your negativity bias, right? From the evolutionary standpoint, we are programmed to see negative things. And that makes sense because we were detecting threats. We wanted to see the negative first, because if we're just, frolicking around in a field of flowers and a bear eats us, right? We might have enjoyed that moment, but then we died, and then humanity doesn't continue. So that's a bad thing. But in today's world, we're triggered by so many things that activate that negativity bias, that it's no longer adaptive for us to function, right? So you still want to see threats in your life. You want to see the bad things. You don't want to waltz into something with rose-colored glasses all the time. But there are times where that becomes negative and affects our ability to process life in general. So what we have to do instead is use that gratitude to help us, again, balance that perspective. Sure, there are things in life that are bad, but if we focus only on those, we become paralyzed. On the other hand, if we focus only on the good things, then maybe we're not fixing problems or participating in something where we might be moving humanity forward. So I think that idea of gratitude as a practice is important, and a daily practice. It's really easy to get off track. If you start with one day of non-gratitude, and for people who work out a lot, one day of not working out can lead to a week of not working out. And you start to feel tired, right? Same thing with gratitude. If you start losing the ability to be grateful, it's easy to spiral downward and focus only on the negative things. So one of the things I want to address is death. So a friend of mine, her dad is in critical care right now, and he's up there in age, and so it's something that if he does pass away, that they are expecting, but she's very close to him, and she knows that she's going to struggle when he passes. So my dad passed away 2 years ago, a little under 2 years ago, and he had been on the decline for many years. He had been injured for, I think, 25 years. He had just showed up with throat cancer recently, and he smoked his whole life, so it wasn't a terribly big surprise. He wasn't able to be treated because of his injury. He couldn't lay down, so he couldn't get chemo. So it was something where it was not at all surprising. And I can't say that I was sad. I wasn't sad that he passed because he had been in pain for so long. I was more relieved for him. But that didn't mean that I didn't feel the loss. I felt the loss acutely, and it was about 2 days after he had passed. So he always sang my brother and I to sleep. So he loved to sing, he loved music, he's a big Elvis Presley fan. And so I sing my kids to sleep because I like to sing and I like music. And it was about 2 days after he had passed, and I sang my daughter to sleep, and then I came down and I just started crying. And when I reflect on it, I wasn't crying because I was sad, right? He was gone, and there was definitely a void, there was a hurt there. But I was actually crying because I was overwhelmed with the connection, the meaning that he had imparted on my life. So it was really because I was so grateful for what he had done for me and how he helped me become who I was. Now, my dad wasn't a saint. He had issues like everybody has issues. But when I think back on my memories of him, I remember the good things. I know the bad things. He ended up being fairly racist and closed-minded at the end, because when you're stuck at home watching cable news all day, that can happen to an older white guy. And I did not let him get away with it either. I would challenge him, but we would have discussions. But that's not what I think of. That's not what I feel when I think of him. I remember what he contributed to my life. I remember how he told me to always tell the truth, and that's something that I still hold very dear today. And he told me that as long as I tried my best, and I know that I tried my best, that's what matters. I only remember those things about him, or feel those things. Those are the things that live with me. And so when we think about loss, it's okay to feel it. But then I think it's important to focus on what we're grateful for. Because we've talked about in other services that it's all about imparting meaning, and that meaning continues forward. Right? We are meaning-making creatures, we humans. We understand things through the stories we tell ourselves. And so if the stories we tell ourselves are negative, then that's the meaning we create. But if the stories we tell ourselves are positive, but also realistic, then that's the meaning we create. So for me, when I think about loss and I think about my dad, that's how I think about it. I do feel his loss. I am sad that he's gone, but I'm also grateful because that's the nature of things. I'm grateful for what he gave me. And so my grandpa died many, many years before that, and we came together, and there are 13 grandchildren under my grandma and grandpa on my mom's side. And we all came together, and none of us were that sad. I mean, my grandpa was old, he was in his 80s. But we shared the stories. We shared the stories that we remember. So I remember going out and getting a Christmas tree with my grandpa and my little brother. And we helped, right? We were probably, 6 and 8 or something like that. And I remember the other cousins talking about, we would always go sledding in their property. And we would talk about ravishing their raspberry bush, which grew outside their house, which was awesome. And it didn't really decrease the amount of hurt we felt, but it made that hurt bearable. Because it gave us the other side of it, which is that gratitude. And nothing but time really diminishes the hurt. And even then, it's always still there. But to me, that hurt is indicative of the meaning they've imparted on us. Because we always get to choose what to do with that meaning. And so if we feel it a little bit, I think that's good. I think that allows us to realize its value and to move forward with it. So, to take away from today, we start with happiness. What happiness is, what happiness isn't. Like I said, there's a lot of science out there. Read it. Happiness is something you create. The second thing is perspective. To allow ourselves to be happy, we've got to create that perspective. We have to seek it out. We have to go out and get those experiences that allow us to see the world in a more realistic way, and I'll leave that as a general term. And then third, we have to be grateful. We've got to practice gratitude, not just hope for it, not just appreciate it when it shows up, but to do it deliberately, just like we would work out. It's the same thing. You're working out your brain and focusing on the things that are positive in your life. Some other things that we can do is change your environment. If you have friends that are bringing you down, that always help cause you to feel negative, leave them. And I appreciate people who want to bring others up. That's great. But when people don't want to be brought up, or when you realize that you've reached your limit in being able to help them, you have to realize that you have to take care of yourself. Much like in an airplane, you can't help anybody else if you don't have your oxygen mask on. And I think that's important to remember. Don't live on social media. It's not real, right? It's the projected perception that people want you to see. And it's very easy to be caught up in the negativity. It's even for me when I read my news app, there's so many negative stories in there. And yet I know that there are good people, many of them in this room, just trying to do good things for other people. And so it's important then to seek out both of those things. Again, not wear those rose-colored glasses and say, oh, the world's perfect, we can just all go on together. No, we still have to fix the problems. But to not let ourselves be caught, be mired down in a swamp of sadness. And then seek the goodness in the world. Go out and volunteer. See other people volunteering. Just help people. Say nice things. Picking up trash. There are so many easy things, low-hanging fruit, that we can do to not just make ourselves feel better, but make other people feel better. Being kind is one of those things. And then give yourself some grace. It's okay if we feel negative every once in a while. Humans are roller coasters of emotion. And it's okay to fail. In fact, learning to fail well is one of the best things you can do to protect yourself from that idea of negativity. I just encountered someone that I know who just owned up to the idea that he had failed, and failed big in his life. And I hope that he can make his way back from that. But that acknowledgement is critically important in realizing that I failed and I'm still alive. And I can now move forward because I've acknowledged that. And then again, practice that gratitude. That's something we usually do at the end of our service, so we'll do that today as we'll talk about something that we're grateful for. But the idea I want to leave you with is this. Life is about the meaning we create. And it helps us not to dwell on what we have lost, but on what meaning we can create for the future. So with that, thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a wonderful week.